We've been very lucky this semester to have Therese Cory here to teach us all about Thomas Aquinas. And this has been going on since the middle of February. And sadly, this is the last of her 3 lectures. But it has been really wonderful to have you here, Therese, and we really look forward to your talk today.
So given that this is my last talk here and my last week here, actually, I wanted to thank the Duke Philosophy Department again for having me out. I've really had a tremendous time here, and it's really been wonderful to get to know so many people and have some wonderful conversations. So it's been a very enriching experience to spend the time here in the Philosophy Department. So my talk today is basically a condensation of the last chapter of my book project, one that I just finished, which is on thinking as being in Aquinas. And there's a connection to the first lecture if you were here. So I thought some people might have questions about how this links up with some of the themes we were talking about in terms of there being 2 models of the mental in the medieval period. So the first thing that you see on your handout is a chart that situates the models that we're going to be talking about this afternoon with the one in relation to the ones we were talking about now 1 month ago. So if you just look at the chart, the broad picture here is that what I want to sort of set up as the framework to talk about Aquinas' view is there's a variety of different models for thinking about the mental, one of which is connective. Another one has to do with information processing. And a third is the one that I talked about previously, which is a model that has to do with thinking as the acquisition of conscious being. So that was the ACB model, if you were there for last time. So the 2 models that we were talking about is a version of the connective model, which is the medieval gaze plus sign model in Augustine and Peter Abelard. And then the ACB model, a version of that model, is the one that we find in Thomas Aquinas that I'm going to talk about today, which is the nature among natures model. So I'm going to be looking at an aspect of that in this talk, just so that you get the landscape. All right, so how should we think about thinking itself? And one widespread model is connective. We might imagine the mind and the world as though they were 2 physical objects that are separated by a space, the so-called mind-world gap, which thinking is supposed to overcome in some way. And within this connective model, we puzzle over whether the mind is really able to connect to things outside or only to things inside. So here's Malebranche, for instance. This is on the handout. He says, "I think everyone agrees," that's nice, "that we do not perceive objects external to us by themselves. We see the sun, the stars, and an infinity of objects external to us. And it is not likely that the soul should leave the body to stroll about the heavens, as it were, in order to behold all these objects. Thus, it does not see them by themselves, and our mind's immediate object when it sees the sun, for example, is not the sun, but something that is intimately joined to our soul. And this is what I call an idea. Thus, by the word idea, I mean here nothing other than the immediate object or the object closest to the mind when it perceives something. It should be carefully noted that for the mind to perceive an object, it is absolutely necessary for the idea of that object to be actually present to it. And many Thomists have wanted to counter claims like the ones that Malebranche makes. So they have long argued that the direction of contact goes the other way. So you'll find many readers of Aquinas arguing that for Aquinas, thought has what's called an ecstatic character, which is capable of, quote, slipping free of the spatial boundaries of our own being and living outside those frontiers. Or in the words of Peter Geach, reaching up to the extramental reality. So either the mind comes in, the things come into the mind, or the mind goes out to things, but somehow that gap has to be crossed. So either way on this spatial connective model, thinking consists in establishing a connection that overcomes a distance. And the disagreement that we're all familiar with in debates about representation or realism merely concerns whether that connection is directly forged with the extramental object, or whether the mind can only connect with things inside itself, intramental ideas, and then perhaps indirectly through them connect to extramental things. So that's one type of model for thinking, the spatial connective generally. But there's another widespread model for thinking about thinking, and that's the mechanistic model of information processing. So we only need to spend a few minutes online to see how many people imagine the brain as some kind of computer, or how tempting it is to attribute mental characteristics to any kind of AI algorithm that can leverage data sets into products resembling the product of human creation. And on this model, thinking is a kind of calculating. It's the manipulation of data via algorithms to produce results, which in thinking are true judgments or other kinds of products. For philosophers, Hilary Putnam popularized the analogy of the mind to the Turing machine, and one also finds this language of information processing in the literature on Aquinas. So sometimes knowledge is described as something like, quote, content set into an order by a set of logical relations. So spatial connective models come into play philosophically when we're imagining thinking as a static, self-contained sort of action, like admiring the beauty of a geometrical proof or recognizing the solitary nature of cats. But then we tend to fall back on information processing models when we imagine thinking as problem solving. So calculating how many Olympic-sized swimming pools it would take to fill up a football stadium, or evaluating whether jaywalking is morally wrong. Or like Albert the Great, Aquinas' teacher, figuring out why bears and some women hibernate in the wintertime. It's an actual example. I don't know where he got this from. So Thomas Aquinas might tell us that these models are describing different intellectual operations. So he's got 3 different kinds of operations. This is listed on your handout. And we might say that the connective model perhaps describes what he calls the first operation, which is simple apprehension. And that's the act of understanding some kind of unity, like cat. So if we imagine grasping cat, we imagine ourselves getting in touch with something external, and hence the connective imagery. Whereas the information processing model seems to describe what he calls the second and third operations. So the second operation is composition and division. That's the action of forming propositions. And discursive reasoning, which is the action of drawing conclusions from premises. So when we imagine ourselves figuring something out, contact with the real no longer seems like a big deal. Instead, we imagine ourselves manipulating materials in an intramental space, which are terms and propositions that we're organizing relative to each other. So these 2 models provide separate and unrelated pictures of the corresponding intellectual activities. And maybe with a bit of massaging, we could make them fit into a single theory. So for instance, we could explain that our contact with real things provides intramental content, but then we manipulate that content by organizing it into larger complexes through composition and division, and then ultimately reasoning. Or we could say that propositions and arguments do ultimately get us connected with real extramental things, such as the football stadium or acts of jaywalking. But fundamentally, these models are not really parallel. They don't really even address the same aspects of of their corresponding intellectual operations. So one model, the connective model, is completely occupied with the relational dimension of our cognitive activity, but doesn't shed any light on what the activity itself is like. Whereas the other one, the information process one, stresses the internal characteristics of the activity, but doesn't say anything about its relativity. So it's very hard to combine spatial connective imagery and data processing imagery and get any kind of coherently unified picture of intellectual thought. So in this talk, what I want to suggest is that Aquinas gives us a different model for thinking about thinking, and that's one that does provide a coherently unified picture of intellectuality. And this is the model that I want to call the nature among other natures model. So this is a way of thinking about intellectual being as a nature among other natures in the natural world. So what does Aquinas mean by a nature? This is a naturally occurring reality that that's a principle of change through the tendencies it has towards being acted upon or acting in certain ways that are proper to it. So natures could be substantial natures, cow nature or human nature, or they could be accidental natures like redness or musicality. They could be inanimate, like stone nature, or living, like oaks, insensate or sensate, et cetera, et cetera. It's important that they be naturally occurring types of being, not artifacts. So for Aquinas, a nature is a principle of actuality and potentiality and a principle of change. And what I want to argue is that the nature that's actualized within us when we begin to think is no exception. We can make sense of what Aquinas calls the three operations or three types of activity of intellect as just a sequence of natural actions that arise from the nature of this intellectual being when we acquire it in ourselves. In other words, these actions become available to perform once the nature of intellect, which is equally the nature of an intelligible thing, is realized in us through intellectual form. So the picture that's going to emerge from this is that intellectuality or intelligibility is best understood as a kind of life, a living being that takes shape in us through its own agency, together with the influence of agents in our environment, and that grows and develops itself towards its mature and ever more complex and orderly shape. So in this picture, it's the internal characteristics of this nature and its corresponding activity that account for thinking in all its forms. The relatedness of thinking to something other than itself only becomes important when we come to the question of how to measure or evaluate the success of an intellectual operation. So let's proceed as follows. The first thing that I'm going to do is briefly describe the kind of being that we acquire when we begin to think, which is actual intellect, because that's the nature that's going to make sense of these various kinds of intellectual activities. Then I'll examine what the nature among natures model can teach us about each of the three operations of intellect and explain how they fit into a single story of how intellect develops itself from an immature to a mature state. So knowing in this picture is growing, hence the title of the talk. Okay, first section on the knowetic nature. Aquinas tells us that nothing acts except insofar as it is actual. And similarly, that a thing acts in virtue of its form. So a form is what makes something actual. And on this picture, an actual being that something has gives rise to its actions. Nature provides the power to act in the way stipulated by that nature. So if something is actually cold, it performs the action of chilling. An actually hot tea heats the surrounding cup. An actual rabbit performs rabbity actions like hopping or nibbling clover or startling easily or procreating profusely. So the basic idea here is something like this. Something, A, is actually X in virtue of having the form of X. So form gives rise to actuality. And then A is able to perform X-type action in virtue of being actually X, which we can say in virtue of having the form of X. So form and actuality go together and give rise to action. That's the picture. So in the case of the intellectual nature, the relevant form is what Aquinas calls an intelligible species. So this form makes something actual in us. And I think that's a point that's often gotten missed when people are reading Aquinas' theory of intellect. They'll look at what he talks about as an intelligible species abstracted from sensory experience and think, oh, he's talking about a concept or an idea or something, like some kind of mental representation. But fundamentally, what Aquinas construes the intelligible species as is a form that gives us a certain kind of actuality. It makes a certain being actual in us. And that's the first important point that we have to keep in mind. The intelligible species is a form that bestows on us being of a certain kind. So I want to call this knowetic being. It's the being that's proper to a knowetic nature. So what kind of being is knowetic being? More specifically, Aquinas calls this intellect in actuality, or equally, intelligible in actuality. And these two labels come down to the same thing. what the kind of being that the form makes us have, the intelligible species makes us have, is a being that is at once thinking being and thought being, intellect being and intelligible being. They're two dimensions of the same kind of being. So as I argued elsewhere, which is the first half of the book project that this is taken from, Aquinas' knowetic being is self-manifesting being. So knowetic being is the very stuff of which the thinking intellect is made. It is the stuff of thought, the stuff of the actual intelligible. It is a being that is essentially luminous for itself. It is an episode of conscious intellectuality, if we want to put it that way. So this self-manifesting nature is just what the intelligible form actualizes in us, just as the form of heat makes something actually hot. It's an accident of our soul, according to Aquinas, but it is the kind of accident that completes our substantial nature as human beings. So it's teleologically perfective sort of accident. So now we might ask, once we have this kind of being, self-manifesting being, what kind of action results from this nature? Not surprisingly, perhaps, Aquinas describes the first operation of intellect, the first type of activity that intellectual being performs, as analogous to shining. So in his disputed question, De Veritate, question 8, article 6, he describes two kinds of actions that we now would correspond with what we now call transitive action and immanent action. So he says that there's transitive actions that are from an action and unfold in a patient, and they change the patient. Whereas an immanent action remains in the agent as its perfection. So a transitive action might be something like heating, the hot thing, the action of heating is from the hot thing, and it's a change that is happening in the patient. Whereas the immanent action, typically Aquinas gives the examples of mental activities like perceiving, fearing, imagining, or thinking, which don't change anything outside the agent, but are simply perfections. They remain in the agent as a perfection. But this is one text where he gives another example of an immanent action from a physical creature. That's a non-mental example, namely a naturally luminous body like the sun or fire. So he says that the luminosity of the sun gives rise to two types of actions. On the one hand, there's shining, and on the other hand is illuminating. He says shining is an immanent action that remains in the luminous body as its perfection. It's just the brilliance that is the perfection of a luminous body. Whereas illuminating is a transitive action that changes other bodies by brightening them. So Aquinas says similarly, thinking is an immanent action that proceeds from the being that we get from the intelligible species, from knowetic being, from the being that is at once actual intellect and actual intelligible. So he says, just as a bright body shines when light is actual in it, the intellect thinks everything that is actually intelligible in it. So the first and most fundamental thing that a luminous body does is to shine, and the first and most fundamental thing that a self-manifesting being does, an actual intellect, is to think as an action. Thinking is an intellectual shining, a self-revealing or self-displaying or self-manifestation. To shine in this way, something must be mentally bright, which is to say it must be actually intelligible. And in fact, Aquinas, if you're familiar with his theory of the agent intellect, as a kind of light in the soul, something that he gets from Aristotle. He describes the light of the agent intellect as just the sheer actuality of intelligibility or manifestness in the soul. So the first activity, the first intellectual activity, contemplative thinking or simple apprehension, is most fundamentally a kind of mental shining. It is not a connection between a subject and an object. It's not even a connection between intellect and an intelligible, as though the intelligible, let's say treeness, whatever it is that we're thinking about, is something extramental. Rather, Aquinas insists that it is only when a form becomes actual in us, let's say it's tree form becoming actual in us, that an actual intelligible comes to be in me, which is just identical with my actualized intellect. Because for Aquinas, as for many thinkers in this tradition, going back to Alexander of Aphrodisias, there is no way to be an intellect other than to be an intelligible. So he says, the thinker and what is thought, insofar as something one is made from them, which is actual intellect, are one single principle of the action that is thinking. So we can think about the operation of contemplative thinking as just the radiance or glow of that new actuality in the thinker. So what we're seeing here is a very different picture from the one that the connective model suggested. What makes thinking be thinking is not its capacity to connect us to an extramental world or its ability to, quote, slip free of the metaphysical boundaries of the mind. What makes thinking be thinking is its nature as a kind of mental shining. Thinking is the soul's shining, and it shines in the way specified by the form it receives. A frog form makes it frogly actual, which gives rise to a frog shining. A rose form makes it rosely actual, giving rise to a rose shining. So if this is starting to sound a little bit like adverbial theories of intentionality, you're on the right track. I think that's exactly what's going on here. Aquinas' contemporaries thus compared the intellectual soul to the cat's eye, which can illuminate colors in the dark. But it would be easier to see the point by comparing the soul to a glow-in-the-dark chameleon, which takes on the colors of its surrounding and glows with those colors. It's always, can't come up with good analogies for this stuff, but I try. Thought is a nature whose proper activity is to shine. So we could say that knowing is glowing. So if we follow the nature among nature model, then we must ask, what else can this nature do besides shining or simple contemplative thinking? And Aquinas identifies, as we just saw, two more activities of intellect: composition and division, which forms propositions, and discursive reasoning, which draws conclusions out of premises. So how should we think of these ones? Are they also a kind of shining? Not exactly. Instead, they are self-developing activities. They're the intellect's activities of growing, so to speak, towards a more mature condition of shining even more perfectly. And we can begin to see this if we look at some of the analogies that Aquinas uses when he's talking about the second and third operations of intellect, which tend often to be biological analogies. So for instance, he argues that composition and division, which is forming many intelligibles into a complex unity, is akin to the mixing of elements into a new substance. He also surprisingly often compares errors to monsters. So if you know anything about medieval theories of generation, monsters are a big concern. Generation goes wrong and produces a monster that doesn't have the right kind of nature as the result of the generative process. But he often uses this as an analogy to talk about the process of forming an incorrect proposition or drawing a conclusion, a false conclusion from premises. He will also call syllogistic reasoning a kind of motion toward an end, like other natural motions. And he compares arguments with varying degrees of capacity to produce certitude to natural causes that have varying degrees of power to bring about their end. And I want to argue that we need to take these kinds of analogies seriously. We might think, oh, he's just drawing on some hand-waving comparisons to help people understand what he's talking about. But if you really think about these comparisons, they're not at all helpful unless he means the comparison in some kind of rigorous way, because there's no reason to expect that there should be anything like reasoning or forming propositions in the natural world. And so it's a very odd move for him to make unless he thinks that the parallel is actually substantive in some way. And so I want to argue that for Aquinas, biological growth and intellectual learning are two examples of the basic tendency of living things. And that tendency of living things is just to develop themselves actively toward their own perfection by rearranging themselves into a more perfect form. These activities are goal-directed because they're oriented towards intellect's natural end, which Aquinas describes as ultimate truth or a complete conformity to the structure of created being. And the human intellect is the only type of intellect that needs to develop, Aquinas explains, because our initial acquisition of forms is always imperfect. Bodily substances don't manage to assimilate us completely to them on the first try. We always start out with some kind of knowledge that's more universal and indistinct, and then it develops into a more specific and distinct form. So if I first encounter a frog, I'm going to grasp it as a living thing that's hopping, but then only later am I going to distinguish amphibians from mammals and frogs from toads and make those kinds of distinctions. However, when we think about this process of the activities that he describes as the activities whereby intellect grows, it's very hard to let go of an information processing model when we're thinking about forming propositions and reasoning to conclusions. And the reason is that the notion of composing a proposition makes us imagine the mind as a kind of machine, which is different from the bits of information or data or materials that are being assembled into some kind of proposition or argument in larger and larger complexes. So the sort of shift in thinking that I propose is that we have to think about intellect as a living nature, which isn't processing a product separate from itself, but is actually developing itself into something more perfect. So knowing as a form of growing. And that is what I will explain about the second and third operations of intellect. Okay, so let's consider the second and third operations of intellect as activities of intellectual growth. We can begin with the second operation, which Aquinas calls composition and division. So I understand composition and division as the action of assembling a proposition for the first time, which terminates in a more complex understanding, which is supposed to be at least truer or more perfectly assimilated to the way things are. So this activity is not the activity of judgment, but it typically gives rise to judgments. And I'll say more about that in a moment. Nor is it an act of propositionally structured thinking. Rather, it's an action of learning, of generating a complex in the first place. So the intellect makes itself more complex in order to become more perfect. So Aquinas explains this activity of composition as the intellect's combining parts into wholes, so those would be affirmative propositions, in order to think many as one. So we could think about the frog and amphibian being composed together into the proposition, frogs are amphibians. And when I have that complex, I'm able to hold frog and amphibian in relation to each other at once and think both of them at once, many as one. Now, composition for Aquinas is always an act of introducing order. So when I compose parts into wholes, the order is always twofold. The parts are ordered to some common goal, and thus each part is ordered in its own distinctive way to the other parts. So let's use the analogy of artifacts for a moment. So if you think of a house that's made of concrete blocks, bricks, and thatch, how does the builder compose the material into parts of a whole house? Aquinas would say, well, that's by ordering all of those parts jointly to the common good of shelter. And by doing so, ordering the parts relative to each other, giving each a distinctive role in the intended structure relative to the other parts. So concrete blocks become a foundation by being ordered towards supporting the walls and the roof. Thatch becomes a roof by being ordered towards protecting the walls and the foundation. Bricks become walls by being ordered towards holding up the roof above the living space supported by the foundation. So in an artifact like a house, the order that composes the parts into a whole is added by the maker. And this order is just what Aquinas calls the house's form. It's an order that originates in the human mind and then is introduced into the building materials. And it's important to note that artificial form really is form for Aquinas. So a house form makes the parts be a house and unifies it as one thing. But it has an important difference relative to natural form, like the form of a cow, because an artificial form is always ordering materials, each of which retains its own independent nature. So the ordering of bricks into a house just makes them be house parts, but it doesn't make them be bricks. They have their own brick form for being brick. And that's different from a cow soul, which is not only ordering legs and kidneys into one living cow, but also making the parts be what they are, cow leg and a cow kidney. So that means for Aquinas, the cow is more unified than the house is because of just one form, as opposed to an overarching form of arrangement and then all of these little subforms in an artifact. So we can apply this understanding of composition to our intellectual case as follows. Intellectual composing is the act of ordering natural noetic materials, or simple instances of noetic being, as parts into a whole. So when I learn what a frog is and what an amphibian is, I acquire these two instances of noetic being, self-manifesting frog, self-manifesting amphibian. But when I compose them, I'm ordering them into a new whole. Frogs are amphibians. Now, the form of this thought is going to be an order that springs from the human mind and is imposed on parts, noetic amphibian, noetic frog, that retain their own integrity with a unity that's inherited from the creatures that acted on this intellect in the first place to introduce their form in the intellect. So in that respect, the complex that emerges from this act of composing is an artificial whole. But at the same time, this artificially induced whole is still a natural perfection of a living being, which is the human being. So it's included in the goal at which human nature aims, and it's made of the living stuff of actualized intellect itself. And we'll see in the conclusion why that's important. So this is all pretty straightforward. I think anybody who reads Aquinas could agree with this so far. But here's the catch. When Aquinas describes the intellect as composing intelligibles with each other, he's actually describing the intellect as rearranging itself. Because as noted above, the actual intelligible is the actual intellect. So when I'm thinking frog, this actually intelligible frog is the very stuff of my actualized intellect. And when my intellect rearranges frog and amphibian into the proposition frogs are amphibians, it is rearranging bits of itself into a complex actuality, enabling itself to shine in a new and more complex way. So now we might start to wonder, well, what kind of order is the intellect giving itself when it rearranges itself propositionally? If I'm composing physical materials, the order of the parts in an artifact is always going to involve relative position. The walls go under the roof and over the foundation. But we can't think about composing frog and amphibian together in the same way. They're not going to be spatially related to each other. So I would suggest that we should think of one intelligible, the intelligible in the predicate position, as making the other intelligible in the subject position more determinate. So amphibians, as the predicate, makes frogs more determinate. And the complex thought, frogs are amphibians, is a more determinate thought than the simple thought, frog. So there's a special kind of, or we could think about it this way, there's a special kind of order that pertains to the intellect, which is not an order of spatial positioning, but rather a relationship of the indeterminate to the determinate. It's a kind of determining relationship, and that's how you get these intellectual complexes. And this account of intellectual composing as determination nicely coheres with Aquinas' view that human knowing is initially indistinct, including many only potentially, and as it becomes gradually more distinct, we are actualizing what is potential in our earlier thought. Propositions just actualize latent potentials in the intelligibles that we receive. So in other words, the act of composing nests two intelligibles or two thoughts into a more complex whole in which one part becomes the determination of a potential in the other. So when I introduce this nested order, my intellect becomes not an unordered many, but a many in one. There's interesting things to say about how this connects up with certain themes in Neoplatonism from a lot earlier that Aquinas was probably not aware of at all. But we could talk about that later. So far we've been discussing composition merely in terms of an act of self-development. So the intellect's act of nesting one episode of noetic being within itself, within another, which is nesting one part of itself within another part of itself to give itself more structure. But in rearranging itself in this way, the intellect is aiming at some end. So just as every motion aims at some end. And Aquinas calls this end the good of intellect, or truth, which he construes as intellectual assimilation to the being of things. And so what I want to suggest is that this gives us an interesting way to think about truth in Aquinas in terms of the nature of intellect and not just in terms of a kind of one-to-one correspondence or truth value of a proposition, for instance. We can start to see truth instead in Aquinas as the teleological resting point of a vital process, and assent to a true proposition as the actual intellect's settling or fixing itself in that endpoint, resting there as a condition that's good for it. And the intellect doesn't just blindly settle there just because its new ordering happens to make it more true, but rather the intellect has to actively commit itself to this new order as having attained the desired goal, deeming the new arrangement a proper arrangement to settle into. So that's how I think we should think about judgment in this case. It's a kind of actively or consciously settling into a new complex arrangement of intellect. And if this is the right way to understand assent, then it becomes clear why composition and division is often confused with judgment in Aquinas' writings by a number of readers of Aquinas. When the intellect forms a proposition for Aquinas, the intellect is not just aiming to rearrange terms any old way. It's trying to achieve greater internal conformity to the being of things. It's trying to reach a state where it can settle as a normative resting point. So in reordering itself through composing and dividing, the intellect normally settles into assent. And a truthful judgment of truth is the proper terminus of the motion that is composition and division. I think there will probably be really interesting things to say about this in relation to thinking about disagreement or propaganda or various things. I think Aquinas has a very sort of optimistic view of intellect as having a nature that has an inclination in a particular direction. And so it has this inclination to settle in these conditions that's aiming for greater conformity with the way things are. Okay, so now this kind of settling, maybe one more thing to say about this is that this kind of settling for Aquinas varies in degree of strength. So this is a way to make sense of what he talks about as different degrees of assent in some of his texts, for instance, in the Summa Theologiae. So he says that sometimes intellect necessarily assents to certain propositions. So in a per se known proposition, the assent is compelled by the proposition's internally evident truth. But when I'm reasoning from arguments, the conclusions of those arguments may be compelled, he says, by the efficacy of the demonstration, but they more often depend on the will. So the efficacy of the argument or the force of the argument doesn't compel me to settle in the conclusion. And it's to such an extent that one of Aquinas' objectors at one point suggests that maybe assenting just is an act of will, like consenting. But Aquinas responds that in the case of voluntary assent, assent is an act of intellect insofar as it's determined by will to one. So the picture that he lays out is that depending on how conclusively intellect rests in this goal of truth, the intellectual assent to a propositional structure may be firmer or weaker. So he talks about firm assent in contrast with what he calls a weak and tottering assent that we give to propositions that we hold as opinions. This is opinio. And sometimes he says, when we compose and divide a proposition, no assent follows. So intellect might remain unknowing, that's nesciens, with having no inclination either to assent or to dissent. So it simply doesn't settle, it doesn't not settle, it's just in a kind of stasis. Or it might have an equal inclination to assent and dissent and is unable to settle on either. And for Aquinas, that's the condition that we're in when we set up a doubt or what he calls a dubitatio, and that motivates an inquiry. So that's the start of our trying to figure something out, taking a kind of curiosity. But intellect can also take this new reordering as a provisional stopping point, as when it suspects the truth of the proposition. This is suspicatio, he calls it. So these various cognitive states that he describes, I suggest, are just intellect's various ways of settling or not settling on the new intellectual ordering that it has achieved in its acts of composing and dividing. So what that means is that intellect has to be able to evaluate when its new configuration is a suitable place to settle. And this takes us to the third and last intellectual operation, which is discursive reasoning. So what is the act of discursive reasoning in Aquinas? He describes this as discoursing from one to another in order to arrive at what is unknown from what is known. And he just has in mind here the activity of drawing conclusions from premises. So there would be a preliminary sort of part of the activity that involved lining up the premises, but then the sort of paradigmatic act of reasoning is the act of drawing a conclusion from those premises. So we might wonder, now that we've explained the second activity of intellect, composing and dividing, in terms of assembling noetic units into complexes, should we just explain reasoning the same way as assembling those propositional complexes into even larger complexes, which are arguments? And I don't think we should do that. I think that's not how Aquinas is thinking about it. So both of them, of course, are learning activities whereby the human intellect introduces new order within itself. Both of them can fail so as to produce monstrous results, the intellectual equivalent of a two-headed calf. But reasoning cannot merely be a meta-composing, or it wouldn't be a third kind of intellectual activity in the first place. Rather, Aquinas describes it not in compositional terms, but in terms of motion. Reasoning is a motion-like process, like generation, which draws out an effect, here the conclusion, from pre-existing materials, which are the previously known premises. That's the first distinctive feature of reasoning. But the second distinctive feature of reasoning is that the order that reasoning adds, that intellect adds to itself when it's reasoning, is not a compositional nesting order of making the indeterminate more determinate, but actually a totally different kind of order, which is a stabilizing order. So I just want to focus on this latter point and explain it a little bit more. The idea that in reasoning, intellect bestows on itself a distinctive kind of intellectual order. So recall what reasoning is for in the first place. Reasoning for Aquinas is aimed at establishing the credibility of a proposition, and the credibility has to do with the settling of the intellect as in that propositional structure as it's a good condition for itself. Now, the end point, terminus of a motion of inquiry and discursive reasoning, Aquinas says, is the certitude which is had concerning the conclusions insofar as they are reduced to first principles. Indeed, the whole point of discursion is, quote, so that certitude may be caused. Now, what does Aquinas mean by certitude? So I want to suggest simply noetic stability. It's the strength with which intellect assents or settles into a new complex state. So for instance, Aquinas notes that certitude doesn't just connote evidence, but it also connotes the firmness of adherence. It's a quote. And he compares the certitude of cognition to the certitude of nature, which is the infallibility with which something attains its end through the strength of its power. So he says, for instance, quote, fire has the absolute certitude of heating. And he doesn't mean I get to be absolutely certain that fire heats. He means that fire from its own power has an inner force that inexorably heats. So that inner force that guarantees the action metaphysically is the certitude of the action. And so he'll even say that form is the certitude of each thing, because again, form is the metaphysical guarantee that something is going to act in a certain way. So for instance, imagine that I'm wondering when redbud trees flower, and I perform some kind of investigation. Maybe I ask ChatGPT, or I go to a garden store and ask someone there, or I reason it out according to the nature of certain kind of legumes. But either way, I get a conclusion. The redbud tree flowers only in the spring. Now, when I attain this conclusion, my noetic being, it becomes better ordered than it was prior to reasoning through the nested order of the proposition. But additionally, I see this new nested order as good, true, and therefore my intellect settles into it or adheres to it, resting in it as the conclusion to its efforts. That settling is just my assent, and its stability is just the certitude with which I assent. So what I want to suggest is that the order that intellect introduces in itself through reasoning is just a stabilizing order. By selecting and arranging premises, it's aiming to stabilize itself in the nesting order of the complex conclusion. So another way of thinking about this is that the premises ordered by reason relative to the conclusion lend weight to the conclusion and attract intellect to rest there, remain there. And that weight is coming from the premises, not from the internal structure of the conclusion itself, which is different from the case of per se evident propositions, where the weight attracting intellect to rest in that proposition as a true proposition is coming from the internal structure of the proposition itself. All right, so stability, again, comes in degrees, and the degree of that stability depends on the weight that's provided by the previous discursive motion. So regardless of whether I formed a judgment on the basis of sense experience, believed the testimony of a garden store employee, was swayed by the arts of a demagogue, reasoned demonstratively through various proofs, or just made a guess based on when other trees flower, my assent, if I assent at all on any of these bases, it's because the preceding discursive motion provided an ordering of complexes that lent enough weight to the conclusion to make my intellect feel satisfied to rest there. Different processes may lend more or less weight, which makes it easier or harder, or perhaps even impossible for intellect to withdraw its assent later. And Aquinas here compares again to natural agents. He says the stronger the power of the nature, the more rarely it falls short of its aimed for effect. So now the conclusion. Let me review. What Aquinas presents us, I think, is a picture of intellect as a kind of nature living an intellectual life. And this life most fundamentally consists in the intellect's contemplative thinking, its immanent shining in virtue of the nature of brightness, knowetic being, that it acquires by becoming actualized by the intelligible species or intellectual form. These forms are at first incomplete and indistinct. They enable intellect to glow only imperfectly, in an imperfect conformity to the structure of being. Thus, human intellectuality encompasses other vital activities, composing and dividing and reasoning, which are the activities whereby it grows to intellectual maturity, reorganizing itself toward a complete assimilation to created being. These compositional and rational activities reflect the tendency of all self-developing natures to develop from the simple to the complex, from the imperfect to the perfect, from the less determinate to the more determinate. And it's a picture, I think, that's very far from a kind of information processing model, which imagines the mind assembling these discrete bits of information into more and more complex strings. You've got the kind of biological model on one side and the informational model on the other. So let me conclude with two observations. First, we can see that, very interestingly for Aquinas, truth turns out to be something toward which the mind can grow and develop. So we tend to think about truth in terms of truth value, whether the proposition is true or false, like a light switch that's on or off. And if the proposition corresponds to an existing thing, let's say I say the dog is brown and the dog I'm referring to is in fact brown, then the truth value is a T, it's on. And if the dog isn't brown, let's say it's black, then the truth value of my proposition is F, it's off. But Aquinas, I think, gives us a little bit of a different picture because he sees the conformity of mind to other beings as something that's gradual on a scale into which we grow over the course of our lifetime. And we do this not just by passively acquiring new intelligibles, but also by actively reforming our thinking through the second and third intellectual activities. And in this respect, interestingly, for those who are interested in the history of medieval philosophy, more broadly, Aquinas adopts a view that's more typically associated with Albert the Great and his Islamic predecessors like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes. So that's the view according to which the goal at which the human intellect aims, or at which any intellect aims, is the goal of total conformity to created being. So the aim of an intellect is to be a microcosm, basically. And that's what philosophers are doing, is organizing their intellect and actualizing their intellect to the point at which it's sort of approaching closer and closer to this horizon of being a perfect microcosm of all created being. And Aquinas is often sort of set aside from that tradition as somebody who disagrees with that model. And I think actually that turns out not to be true. He's very much part of this tradition. And the difference between Aquinas and some of his predecessors is just that he's more pessimistic than these predecessors about the possibility that we will actually complete in our lifetime this full trajectory of intellectual growth toward complete intellectual maturity. So he says this late in life, in his commentary on the Liber de Causis, the human possible intellect is from the beginning like a tablet on which nothing is written. Famous example. Only afterwards does it receive forms in a certain order, and then he gratuitously adds, nor is it ever filled up in this life. That's a little bit of pessimism. So it's no surprise that unlike his predecessors, he just does not describe total conformity to all created being as a concretely achievable goal of intellectual life. But that doesn't mean he doesn't think of it as the sort of natural end of the human intellect. It's just that for him, this kind of total conformity to all created being is a merely theoretical horizon towards which our scientific studies aim. Second observation, Aquinas is very clear that the actions of composing, dividing, and reasoning belong only to the kind of intellect that has to develop from potency to actuality, which is our intellect. So of course, he's got angelic intellects and the divine intellect to act as contrast cases, but they don't perform these kinds of self-developing activities. Only our intellects do. And what is going on is the intellect is effectively actively reconstructing the structure of being in its own structure, contributing to making itself into a map of the world. And the crucial thing to notice here is that the intellect itself, the human intellect, is the source of the order that it acquires, whereby it reconstructs itself as a map of the creaturely order. And this means that intellectual complexity is a human-originated order, just like the order that a human artisan adds to materials when making an artifact. So the developed human intellect is an artifact of its own making. Its internal order is the kind of order that originates in minds, namely in itself. And as a result, Aquinas can hold at once that our intellectual achievements can express beings as they are, but also that those expressions are humanly constructed. And this allows him to hold that when we try to make sense of things, our intellect often adds to itself more complexity than there is in the beings that it's seeking to understand. So one example that he gives of this is the relation of self-identity. If I say Socrates is Socrates, that's an ordering that the intellect generates in itself, but is not found in Socrates. And he will even say, and this is perhaps might be surprising given some of the things he says about definition, but he actually explains that a definition, like man is a rational animal, is necessarily more complex than the essence that's being defined. The essence is simple, but the definition is complex. To be human is something one, but when we define it in two parts, a genus, animal, and a difference, rational. The complexity of the definition is useful to us because it helps us locate the essence relative to other essences. And it does express properly what the essence is in itself. But Aquinas cautions there's no correspondingly ordered compound in the thing defined. So it would be a mistake to think of Socrates' humanity as being a compound of animality and rationality in Socrates. So this extra complexity for Aquinas is not a mistake. It's just the way that the human intellect must organize itself in order to assimilate, to the extent possible, the ways that beings are. And at the other end of the spectrum, divine and even angelic knowledge of the creaturely order is, Aquinas says, more simple than the creaturely order is in itself. So what we're witnessing here, I think, is Aquinas' take on the age-old idea, often associated with the Neoplatonic tradition, that the more a form engages with matter, the more it is subject to multiplicity, and the more it approaches unity only through the refracting lens of its own multiplicity. The artifact into which the human intellect makes itself is not a one-to-one copy of the creaturely order, but an imitation that is more complex and jointed than the reality that it imitates. Thank you.